Believe it or not, there's gonna come a day when kids who grew up on modern open world games are gonna look back on this era in 20 or 30 years and go, you know, they don't make them like they used to. Like all things in life, people romanticize the trends of their youth. Gaming has always revolved around trends. In present day, open world and cinematic games are what's white hot popular. In the early 80s, the arcades were flooded with Head-On and Pac-Man clones. In the Super Nintendo era, everything was a side-scrolling beat-em-up. And in the PS2 era, there was an overflowing abundance of 3D action games. The PS2 is home to some of the greatest action games ever made. Devil May Cry 3, God Hand, Onimusha. You'll notice how Capcom was responsible for these. Their developers at the time figured out the recipe to make a satisfying action game. Proper difficulty balance, strong enemy design, responsive controls, and an unobtrusive camera. These are the supporting pillars of any good action game. But the PS2 also housed countless action games that most people forgot about or never gave a chance. These were the games you rented when Blockbuster didn't have the game you were looking for. Can't go home empty-handed, so you walked down the aisle, picked up something with a badass dude carrying a giant sword on the cover, and figured, hey, this is the next best thing. And most of the time it sucked, but for a rental, it was good enough. Remember, this was an era when big-name developers didn't focus on games that required 5-year dev cycles. They didn't have 400-man teams, bloated advertising budgets, and professional voice work. These games were shorter and smaller in scope, which is why there were so many of them. Players actually replayed games. You didn't need to convince the public that they were getting their money's worth from a bloated 20-hour game, packed with cutscenes that you're only gonna play through once. A game being 5 hours long gave you an excuse to beat it again, this time faster or with a higher score. Good luck selling modern audiences on a 3 or 4 hour long game.
The game is all of 4 hours.
And just because a game is mediocre doesn't mean it isn't worth playing. There's value in experiencing something unique, even if it isn't good, or at least I think so. I'm a very inquisitive person, so I love to look at the missed potential of games and see what they got right and wrong. Some of these games came so close to being good, but there was always something that held them back, so we're left with a collection of hundreds of games that time forgot. Because, as we'll see, good ideas alone don't make for good games. Execution and polish are things you should never take for granted. The PS2 had tons of mediocre action games, there's no way I could cover them all, so let's go for a sample platter approach. From games you might have seen before but didn't play, to games you've definitely heard of and probably beat. But instead of just picking a handful of generic action games, I want to talk about ones that tried to bring something new or unconventional to the table. Whether or not they were successful, that's a different story. Blood Will Tell is based on an old-ass manga that most of the Western world probably never heard of at the time, called Dororo. And the story is kind of interesting by action game standards. You're killing bosses to regain body parts, which affects the gameplay in significant ways. Once you unlock your vocal cords, the tinny audio quality goes away, and the main character explains that you can save your game once you reach these save points. Until you get your voice back, he says nothing, so you won't even know that these are save points.
I can save the game here.
When you get your eyes back, the world fills with color, and the game warns you during the tutorial that there's nothing wrong with your monitor because everything is going to be displayed in black and white for a while. And the backstory is told through these montages. They're fully voiced, but it feels like you're listening to an abridged version of the manga. They drone on for just a bit too long. At times, it feels like there are just as many cutscenes as there is action. Not so bad when you consider the premise feels fresh, and this story was originally told in the 60s. Think about that. But you know what's strange? The cutscene direction, despite being essentially a slideshow for some of them, is far more interesting than most modern Japanese games I've played where characters just stand around gabbing. You've got two fighting styles, and in the early game you'll stick almost exclusively to the dual swords. They attack faster and have better combo strings until you start killing more bosses and getting better swords. Enemies suffer from hit stun really easily, which is important for action games. Strong hit stun lets you stay on the offensive and pull off your combos, but your recovery animation when you get hit is absurdly long until you unlock your ears, which lets you recover quicker. So for the early game, you can get stun locked very easily. And that's kind of how it goes with this game. It feels clunky until you unlock body parts that smooth out the experience, like the dash. Your movement speed is so agonizingly slow for the first 2 hours until you finally unlock the dash. It's a game where the premise, cool though it may be, hinders the flow of gameplay. It just doesn't feel all that fun to play until you've played for a few hours and unlocked these different abilities, so unless you stick with the repetitive first chunk of the game, you're not going to experience the best part, the boss fights. Bosses require just enough pattern memorization to beat so you can't face tank every attack, but for fodder enemies, you can just use your charge attack to spawn healing items whenever you want, which has the unfortunate side effect of making every inch of gameplay outside of the bosses little more than filler. If there's no risk of dying, what's the point? Why wouldn't I just run from everything if my main source of progression comes from killing bosses? Optional bosses, called fiends, are hidden throughout the stages, and killing them is how you regain more of your body parts so you can learn new skills. Once you complete a chapter, the game tells you how many fiends you missed. There are plenty of bosses, and considering they're easily the best part, being able to seek them out without relying on a guide for help is a nice touch. There are platforming levels where you control this kid Dororo, and she's clearly not meant to engage in combat, so you just run past everything. Or you can stand still and throw rocks that for some reason deal more damage than your sword. It's got a fixed camera at times, a camera that tracks you, and a freely controllable one, and that's undoubtedly going to take some getting used to for a lot of people, but your best friend is L1, which centers the camera behind your back. For the most part, you don't even need to touch the right stick to move the camera, and once you get used to that, the camera controls quite well. I would have preferred a game with strictly fixed perspectives, which better action games on the PS2 employed, like Devil May Cry and Onimusha. Fiddling with the camera in an action game is the last thing you want to do. But as it stands, this is a fairly simple action game outside of the unique premise and really cool boss fights. There's just not enough depth here to warrant mastering the combat. The combo move pool is very simplistic, so you're just gonna spam the same 1 or 2 strings for most of the game. Most of the fodder enemies aren't interesting to fight either, and the levels are mostly linear. The Dororo platforming levels feel like filler, and the pacing is slow until you unlock enough abilities to use basic features. But the boss fights are cool. If this were a boss rush, it'd be a really special game. Here's a stylish little action game that tries its best to impress you before you even see the title screen. You run around this stage killing enemies for seemingly no reason, then the game turns that few minutes of gameplay into the intro montage. After that, you can watch about 15 minutes worth of mind-numbing tutorials, and I do mean watch. These are the worst kind of tutorials. You don't even practice the inputs, you're just watching a video. These are completely pointless, so just skip them. Here's the story. You're Gact, yes, the singer, and you kill demons for a living. That's it. If you don't want to put in any effort with your story, don't waste my time with unskippable cutscenes. I'm sure using Gact's likeness wasn't cheap and you want to show him off, but the story isn't worth a damn.
You are terrible.
On the surface, Bujingai does everything an action game should do. There are slick movement options, you can scale walls, run across them, glide, and you can chain all of these together to make for some really smooth level traversal. And the levels are designed with this movement in mind. Lots of points where you can fall in a pit and wall run out of it. The verticality here really complements your mobility. Plus the stages have sections that box you in until you kill every enemy, a hallmark of good action games. Being able to just run past everything is a huge problem with this genre, so it's nice to see the fundamentals in place. Not really surprising since the developer is Taito, masters of arcade game design. The combat gives you a ton of tools, but never forces you into using a particular playstyle. You can branch your combos out of a special attack into an uppercut, a kick, or whichever spell you have equipped. This is great for managing crowds because you can change your combo on the fly. A kick can give you breathing room, and a kicked enemy can collide with others. You've also got some really nice defensive options. You block automatically, but there's a gauge that limits the amount of attacks you can guard against. In the middle of blocking, you can either counterattack or jump out of the way. Against magic, you can attack the spell and absorb it. And look at that, there's even a scoring system that rewards you based on your performance. It runs buttery smooth, it looks great, it's got a rockin' soundtrack, it's stylish. But what's the catch? The AI is awful, and for an action game, that's pretty much the most important part. They just stand around and wait all day for you to make a move. If you wait for them to attack, you can counter with the world's largest counterattack window. You can block up to 5 attacks in a row at the start, and you can upgrade your stats to block even more, which means you can safely hammer the attack button in the middle of getting attacked and pull off a counter every single time. Now you could play the game just waiting for every enemy to attack you, but the downside is that this is slow and your combo meter will drop, which impacts your score, so if you're approaching from a scoring perspective, you're not incentivized to cheese the game. But just for survival, it's broken. All the boss fights revolve around the counter mechanic. If a boss casts magic, 10 times out of 10 you want to counter that spell which shreds their health bar. Otherwise you want to mash your ass off until you can pull off a counter and air juggle the enemy. The entire budget went into the motion capture and hiring Gak. The battle programmers took a vacation. The game also suffers from horrendous animation lock. You can't cancel your attacks, and I mean, you can see the impressive flourish for these combos. This game has really fancy animations, but because you can't cancel them, oftentimes you'll whiff and be stuck in that drawn out animation. There is so much wasted time spent juggling dead enemies because you've got these multi-hit attacks that you can't cancel out of. This might be a consequence of the game's auto guard mechanics, so because there's no guard button, you can't cancel the end lag for most of your attacks with a block. Dodging out of attacks is also a no-go, meaning the moment-to-moment combat feels floaty. You're locked into these showy combos and can't do anything but wait for the animations to end. It sucks that I don't have more to say because this game has all the makings for a fantastic hack and slash, and I could forgive the floaty combat, except the one part that matters the most, the enemy design, is a mess. It's a very stylish game, maybe even more stylish than Devil May Cry, but it doesn't have the combat chops to keep you coming back for more. What a shame. If you want to play a randomly generated dungeon crawler on the PS2, do yourself a favor and play Dark Cloud 2. It's got variety, it's got polish, it's got basically everything Crimson Tears doesn't have except for the combat system. Crimson Tears is carried exclusively on the back of its beat-em-up combat. You've got 3 characters and they can each equip different weapons, and each weapon type has its own dedicated combo tree. It's a simple 2-button setup, which means it's very easy to craft your combos, and each weapon offers plenty of options to play around with. Plus it's got a Tekken-style input buffer system where you input your combo chain immediately rather than timing the attacks, and you can cancel out of your combo at any time by dodging out of it, so you're never punished for playing aggressively. There's a weapon durability system in place, so you're incentivized to swap between weapons mid-dungeon, because if your weapon breaks, it's gone for good. You can't fall in love with your favorite weapon without bringing along backups. If you die, you're given one chance to rescue your fallen character, and there's a time limit. If you don't make it in time, or if you die again, all of your carried items are lost. Sure, you can just reload a save, but where's the fun in that? The risk of losing everything complements the Mystery Dungeon-esque structure of the game. The dungeons are randomized each time you enter them, but the room and enemy variety is shockingly small for a randomized dungeon crawler. You'll see repeat rooms on every single floor, all filled with the same handful of enemies. The enemies are actually a threat here. They're aggressive and won't just watch you beat up on their allies. But that has more to do with the claustrophobic size of the rooms. I really wish the game had a grapple option. That's the one thing the combat is desperately missing. Being able to toss enemies into one another or throw them into walls would complement the tighter room sizes nicely. Your combos can hurl enemies into each other, but it's not that reliable. So here's the thing. I don't really like randomized dungeon crawlers. Without handcrafted level design, a number of major issues spring up, the biggest one being balance. The devs can't predict how many enemies you'll fight and what kind of random drops you'll get, which means the difficulty fluctuates between being a total cakewalk and getting your ass beat in seconds. Usually your first foray into a new dungeon will involve killing everything to gain some levels, exiting the dungeon, repairing your weapons, and then going back to repeat this process over and again until you can make it to the boss with full health. And it's a process that you'll never once deviate from. The game even encourages this behavior with the heat system. You've got a gauge that slowly fills over time, and special attacks will fill the gauge faster. And once it maxes out, you'll enter a berserk state where you both deal and receive a ton of damage. Basically a signal to get the hell out of the dungeon if you don't want to die. It gets to be an annoyance when you're taking your time clearing every room when suddenly you enter this berserk status and watch your health drain. You can heal the status with curative items, which means entering the dungeon with one less item slot. I think this health drain mechanic works well in a straightforward action game like Shinobi or Otogi, where the handcrafted stages are designed around the health drain, but here, you want to take your time exploring these floors, leveling up and picking up loot, and this heat gauge doesn't complement that style of gameplay very well. And once you've played for an hour, you've seen everything there is to see. I love the beat 'em up combat, but the way progression works is just way too repetitive because the variety isn't high enough to sustain the randomized nature. You need another 50 room types per dungeon, more bosses, more stage hazards, more everything to make the randomization feel worthwhile. I'm always on the lookout for games that try something different, so when I found out that Death by Degrees has you attacking with the right stick and dodging with the left, I knew I had to play it. Unfortunately, the controls come very, very close to crippling this game, mainly because of the way dodging works. You initiate a dodge by flicking the left stick, but because the left stick is also used for movement, typically what winds up happening is you violently flick the stick praying for a dodge to come out. For normal mobs, not too big of a deal, you can get away with spamming attacks most of the time, but for boss fights, you don't have a choice. You need to dodge. With this boss, if you're not constantly tapping the stick to dodge, you get stun locked by gunfire and die. But even if you tap as fast as you can, you're inevitably going to start walking instead of dodging and you're going to get hit. And the game mocks you when you die by suggesting that you drop the difficulty. Maybe suggest remapping the dodge to a button instead, that might solve the problem. And the game knows you're going to get hit constantly, which is why enemies drop healing items like crazy. I guarantee this game was a disaster during playtesting. Players couldn't get used to the controls, so the devs tried to band-aid the experience by turning every enemy into a healing item pinata. You've got this meaty list of unlockable moves, but look at this. Flick the stick left and right, click R3, hold the trigger in combination with dodging and attacking. It's a mess. The thumbstick combat is not accurate enough to pull off these moves consistently. Instead, you just mash, maybe throw in a grab here and there, and that'll work just fine for most of the game, so learning these combos, cool as they are, I'd love to air juggle these enemies, it's not worth the frustration. It's not an intuitive combat system. Some attacks, like this one where you spin the stick, make sense. This is your crowd control spinning kick. But the rest, like ones where you need to double tap sequentially or move left and right while holding L1 and R1, require memorization. And when you're surrounded by 10 dudes, I'm not going to try to pull off this convoluted combo that involves tapping the left stick. What are you, nuts? Leading with a spin attack and then spamming works just fine. The reason most action games use face buttons for combat is because they are reliable. For a slower paced game like Shadow Tower Abyss, the stick combat is fine, but it's not fine for a game that demands quick reflexes. This is why Monster Hunter moved away from thumbstick combat after the first game. When you press X, you know exactly what kind of response you're gonna get. When you press up on a thumbstick, is it truly straight up, or is it off by a few degrees to either side? Is it all the way up or only partially up? Did you move it slowly or quickly? How quickly did you let go of it so it resets to neutral? All of these factors contribute to the action the game outputs, and it's just not reliable enough for an action game. The menus are also insufferable. There's this horrible delay when you open the menu or switch between tabs. You can't map consumable items to a shortcut button, so every time you want to heal, you've got to deal with this awful delay. There's also just a bit too much loading. Why do I need a load going underwater in a swimming pool, and then watch another loading screen when I resurface? You've got an X-ray attack that shows this drawn-out animation every time you pull it off. There are guns you can't aim, and of course you fire them with the right stick. The game consists primarily of fixed camera angles, and I don't have a problem with that. Not only does it make sense for this game considering the right stick is used for attacking, I think they're integrated, not well, but competent enough. Usually I prefer tank controls in games with fixed cameras because with tank controls, forward is always relative to the direction your character is facing. When you've got cardinal directions for movement, the camera change can trip you up, and it happens sometimes here, but it's not too bad for the most part. Some sections have a tracking camera, and there's a button you can hold to place the camera behind your back. But you know what? I have a soft spot for this game. It's basically a Resident Evil or Dino Crisis style game where you're collecting key items, opening locked doors, and solving puzzles. There's a nice sense of progression where you want to play just a little more to see what's in that new area you opened up. With a better control scheme, I think Death by Degrees would be a better appreciated game. Hot chick in a skimpy outfit kicking ass? Almost always a winning formula. If you've never heard of this game before, there's a reason for that. Not just because it never made its way stateside, but because it's not very good. The US never got Demon Chaos, but the EU did, and for a good reason. We had enough foresight to not waste people's time with this trash. The EU must have much lower standards. You see, Demon Chaos has precisely one thing going for it, and that is the ability to display tens of thousands of enemies on the screen at once. But at what cost? You ever consider why no other game attempted this feat before or since? Look for yourself. Look at the price you have to pay to fight 10,000 enemies in each stage. Not only does the game look ugly as sin, but you're trudging across the same barren fields, fighting the exact same crab enemies the entire time. This game is little more than a glorified escort quest, or maybe it'd be more appropriate to call it a strategy action game. You can't tackle the objectives on your own. You need to escort your army from point to point, babysitting them as they break down crystals. Your army crawls at a glacial pace, and if you move too far ahead of them, they will stop following you. That means slowing down and stopping constantly for the army to catch up, watching the brain-dead AI get hung up on the terrain. Of course, if you could play the game at your own pace, it'd be over in an hour. The game pads out its bloated runtime with so much walking around and waiting. The game thwarts any attempt to maneuver through the stages quickly. There's no jump button, you can't even hop down from knee-high terrain. You are forced to take the long way around every single time. You do get this nifty attack where you spin like a whirlwind across the battlefield, killing thousands of enemies at once, but you'll quickly realize that killing 1,000 enemies in the span of a few seconds loses its luster when you can't even tell what's going on. Sure, the game says I killed 1,000 enemies, but it doesn't look like it. Might as well say I killed 1,000,000 enemies. I can't tell either way. And when they all look the same and evaporate a second after killing them, does it even matter? What exactly is so impressive about killing 10,000 crabs? The challenge comes not from dying to the horde. I'm not even sure if that's possible. It's from making sure your troops live long enough to complete the stages. You can drop pillars for your troops to construct, and these pillars can heal your army or help you destroy structures faster, which of course entails more babysitting to ensure the enemies don't break the pillars. Your combat options are also very slim. You've got a guard button that you'll never use, you can't cancel attacks, and my god do you want to, since the end lag for your attacks is unbearably long. And 99% of the time, doing the whirlwind attack and hammering the square button until your thumb falls off will be good enough. Maybe you could call the premise unique, real-time strategy with action combat, but even in that respect, Kingdom Under Fire: The Crusaders beat it to the punch a year earlier. And it's much better. Sure, you're not killing as many enemies, but what does that matter if killing them brings zero satisfaction? And really, if you want to play a real-time strategy game, just play one. Play Shogun 2, at least the army management there has depth. If you want to play an action game where you mow down 1,000 enemies, play almost any other Musou clone. Almost. You ever wonder why few people talked about Drakengard until Nier came out? Well, wonder no longer. I'm kind of cheating with this entry because I don't think Drakengard is a mediocre action game. As an action game, I think it's outright terrible. No more! There are two parts to this game. It's one part the shittiest Dynasty Warriors clone you've ever seen in your life, and one part the shittiest Panzer Dragoon clone you've ever seen. The hack and slash combat is painful! It's a one combo to rule them all game where you literally spam one combo against everything because no effort was put into balancing this mess. Magic is underpowered, no enemy has hit stun recovery so you can trap enemies into an endless combo loop, there's a severe lack of boss fights, it's as bare bones as it gets. I get it, that's Dynasty Warriors for you, but the good Warriors games bring enough variety to the table to keep you hooked. Drakengard is content with reusing its paltry amount of content and calling it a day. Seriously, the stage variety is a joke. Each chapter is broken up into small levels, but look at them. Constantly pause the map, find out which targets you need to kill, then spam your one combo for every stage. And why am I doing this? What does this have to do with the story? Kill 20 nameless soldiers so I can progress the plot. Why such an arbitrary amount? The objective could be to kill 100 soldiers and it would make no difference. Each stage has a time limit, and the characters are always hounding your ass to hurry up, bemoaning how urgent it is to rescue characters and reach objectives on time. But the time limit for each stage is an hour. A full, real-life hour. As if anyone would ever be in danger of timing out on these stages. What's the point of the timer? Might as well make it 24 hours. Is there weapon variety? You bet your ass there is. Check it out. Each one lets you cast different magic, which is usually useless. And I really love how you're still just spamming one combo for each weapon. That's really cool. Don't even bother switching between weapons frequently since weapons level up based on usage. Even the minimap is terrible because there isn't one. It's just an enemy radar. You need to pause the action to check the map because it would have been so difficult to just paint the corridors on the radar. And it's worth repeating, this is a Dynasty Warriors clone. When you're fighting hundreds of enemies in each stage, it shouldn't take this long to kill one guy. Your attack animations and movement speed are way too slow for this style of game. Of course, the reason why the game is like this is because it's an RPG. You level up, your weapons level up, and that affects your combo count. The game will outright tell you to grind in the free missions to gain levels if you want to kill enemies just a touch faster. Yeah, sure, I'll get right on that. The dragon stages are somehow worse. There's no sense of speed, you just meander around battlefields with this floaty cursor movement until you kill everything. The enemy formations are a joke, no thought went into any of this. Just copy and paste 50 bats and kill them all to proceed. Can you even tell that these are different stages? This is pure filler. If you want to make a competent shooter, there needs to be challenge. There needs to be interesting enemy formations, attack patterns to dodge, stage obstacles to avoid. Give me an interesting scoring system. Instead, the game gives you these hybrid stages where you can mount the dragon to one-shot all the mooks to clear a path, except the game knows that this is too easy, so it introduces enemies immune to dragon fire, which means dismounting and mounting constantly to get through these stages. The one, and I do mean one saving grace, is the story, or to be more specific, the interactions with your companions. That's been Yoko Taro's strong suit since the beginning, and you could make an argument that it's worth enduring this game just to see how much more insane these characters can get. You could make that argument. I wouldn't. This is a budget game, and considering it's fully voice acted, some other aspect needed to be severely cut, and that was the cutscenes. They're presented in the most boring way imaginable. This was the PS2 era, and these cutscenes are less visually interesting than most PS1 games. I'll be honest, you shouldn't play Drakengard, even for the story, because the gameplay is so dull that it isn't worth slogging through to get to the next nugget of story. Watching the cutscenes on YouTube is the way to go. Besides, if you're not playing with a guide, you won't even unlock the true ending because you need to collect every weapon, and there's no way in hell replaying these stages is worth that hassle. If you browse online discussions regarding this game, you'll eventually come across people defending how the gameplay is shitty on purpose, and how its shittiness complements the depressing story. No, don't buy that excuse for 1 second. Bad gameplay is bad gameplay. There's no justifying something that isn't fun to play. This is one of the better examples that proves how storytelling alone cannot carry an RPG. Nanobreaker is the quintessential blockbuster game. This was what you rented when Devil May Cry 3 was out of stock and you didn't want to go home empty-handed, so you picked up the next best thing. And then you reminisce about it almost 20 years later and pretend like you played this hidden gem nobody else knew about. But is Nanobreaker a hidden gem? Not really. It's your dime a dozen hack and slash that doesn't do anything particularly well, but I wouldn't say it has any serious faults. The weakest part is the platforming. Some jumps are difficult to judge, and that leads to frustrating sections like this part in the beginning. If you fall in the water, you don't take damage and respawn nearby. You instead start the entire section over. Later on, there's this part where you need to ascend these rickety platforms, and it's not clear where you're supposed to go once you reach the top. You'll hit the ceiling and fall down on your first attempt. Then you've got these rotating platforms with what are essentially blind jumps, since you need to jump towards the camera before the platforms come in from off-screen. Feels a bit like a 3D Castlevania game, which makes sense when you consider this is the same engine used for the PS2 Castlevanias. Plus, you've got some nice gore, which I'm a sucker for. Every square inch of surface gets drenched with blood, and the game keeps track of the gallons you spill, which is how your stats level up. And if seeing red everywhere isn't your style, you can change the color. You've only got one weapon, but it transforms depending on your combo. These combos all have different properties, so varying your playstyle serves a practical purpose. Too many of these hack and slash games let you get flashy, but there's not much reason to deviate from your bread and butter combo. Here, you've got crowd control attacks, attacks that stun, finishing blows, overhead cleaves, and piercing attacks. Plus some enemies are vulnerable to certain weapon attributes like pierce. Your two basic attack buttons are mapped to horizontal and vertical slices, and the enemy variety does a good job of forcing you to change up your attacks. My favorite are these guys that fire out waves of energy, and the attack they use determines what their weak point is. If they fire a horizontal beam, you've got to use your horizontal slice to kill them. The way you unlock more combos is with these upgrade chips. You can refund your chips for free at will if you want to unlock a different combo. I prefer when games incorporate upgrade permanency. If there's no commitment to your decisions, are they even decisions? What's the point of giving me upgrade points to spend when I can switch between the combos I have available at any point? You could argue that this non-committal approach makes the game more accessible to casuals, but if that were the case, why don't the save points heal you? Instead, it's easy to find yourself stuck before a boss fight if you save at low health. Or you would if the boss fights were actually challenging. Unfortunately, the bosses don't demand you to make the most of your moveset because the AI is terrible. Most bosses can be exploited with very little effort, either push them into a corner and mash, or repeat the same hit and run tactic throughout the entire fight. Some bosses get creative and have interesting patterns, like this one where you need to dodge lasers while pulling the boss out of the tubes with your grapple. But the challenge just isn't there. You have a guard and a dodge roll, but you never need to use them. And in fact, the game doesn't seem designed with defensive play in mind. Positioning matters more than blocking or rolling away from danger. You can also dismember enemies, which affects their behavior. I love destructible enemy parts. You can cripple enemies and watch them crawl across the screen as you focus on the new spawns. Ninja Gaiden 2 elevated this kind of dismemberment by making crippled enemies more dangerous than healthy ones. And that's something that would have made the enemy encounters in this game much more exciting. You can't cancel your attacks, which means combat can feel a bit floaty at times, especially when you start using the powerful transformation attacks. Thankfully, you can control the direction of your attacks mid-combo, and you can pull enemies towards you with a grapple, so you're not whiffing attacks very often. But this is a grounded combat system. Aerial combos are non-existent, which, considering how much platforming there is a bit of a missed opportunity. Missed opportunity describes Nanobreaker in a nutshell. Nothing it does is impressive. It's a simple action game that doesn't bring the heat. It doesn't have satisfying platforming, and it doesn't do anything to stand out aside from the gratuitous blood. It plays fine, but it doesn't play great. Textbook mediocre action game, but you know, I kind of have a soft spot for it. Like I said, I'm a sucker for blood and gore, and if I squint hard enough, I can pretend I'm playing Ninja Gaiden 2. Acquire's entire catalog of almost 30 years is defined by mediocrity, from Tenchu to Octopath Traveler. I know these games have die-hard fans, but it's true. They're usually lacking in depth, which they try to make up for in replay value through unlockables. And they're almost always oozing with charm and style, which can be enough to win people over, including me at times. But even their more obscure games like Shinobito, Kamiwaza, and Katana Kami don't bring anything noteworthy to the table in terms of gameplay. Believe me, I played them. Acquire tried to establish a running theme with most of their games. Action combat with a distinctly Japanese flair, but they never got the formula right.
Well, what do you plan to do with him if you find him, stranger?
So it shouldn't come across as a surprise that people skipped out on Samurai Western, yet another bog-standard action game, except this time with a Wild West texture pack slapped on top. And if you're a fan of the Wild West setting, how many games do you have to pick from? Wild Arms and this? Both Japanese games, funnily enough. Samurai Western is structured like an arcade game. You've got a stage select, and each stage lasts no more than a handful of minutes. It's set up this way because A, you're scored, and B, you're meant to replay these levels even if you don't care about scoring, because the difficulty ramps up quick. Unfortunately, Samurai Western falls victim to RPG elements like leveling up and acquiring new gear. I say unfortunately because it turns what could have been a well-balanced arcade-esque experience where you strive for a 1-credit clear into a repetitive slog. By the time you reach stage 5, if you haven't replayed any levels, you're going to be dealing very little damage and taking a ton in return. Enemies are ceaseless, they never stop respawning, and they are trigger happy to the absolute extreme, especially during boss fights. But just an extra level or two, and maybe a new piece of equipment that comes from leveling up, is enough to trivialize the stages. Your enemy radar is a godsend because it warns you when enemies are about to fire, and considering the camera is a spastic nightmare that will never stop spinning, that means most enemies are going to be firing from off screen, so your eyes will stay glued to that radar. You've got an evasive spin with generous invincibility frames that also speeds up your movement a bit, which means you'll be hammering the spin button pretty much the entire time. Thankfully, the dodge can cancel the recovery frames of your attacks, so the combat flows smoothly. You have one basic attack button that you need to mash like your life depends on it because the respawn rate is ungodly high, so playing this game for more than a few hours starts to get grating. The stage objectives amount to little more than kill enough enemies for the boss to spawn, and with the insane amount of stage repetition, the game gets old very fast. One nice touch is that the enemies can hurt each other, but their health bars become so inflated that it barely matters. Again, this is an acquired game, so they try to make up for the short length and repetitive gameplay by giving you a ton of unlockables. There's a harder difficulty mode, different playable characters, different swords with unique abilities and playstyles, you can customize the look of your character, but the gameplay never evolves beyond mashing. You've got a slow heavy attack and a jumping slash, but most of the time you're mashing dodge to get in close, then mashing your basic combo. The bosses are terrible. They block your attacks frequently, so each fight devolves into baiting their 1 or 2 attacks and punishing with a single combo, then retreating and waiting for them to attack again. They are extremely simple, which is why the game tries to inject challenge by having an infinite supply of enemies spawn around you to annoy the hell out of you. And the worst part about boss fights has to do with how the soft lock-on works. The game prioritizes locking onto the bosses, which means you can be directing your attack at a normal enemy, and the game will force your attack to pivot and aim at the boss if he's too close to you. There's just not much to this game, so at the end of the day, Samurai Western has one thing going for it: charm. And that counts for a lot. Bringing a knife to a gunfight set in the Wild West with a Japanese flair makes for a unique experience. I wouldn't say it's fun to play, but it's worth mashing through these stages just to watch the next cutscene play out, and to see what silly hat you unlock next. But there's no enduring depth here. It's got a scoring system that really doesn't incentivize you to play your best, because leveling up is your solution to every problem, and it results in better scores. Your clear time is not weighed heavily enough to offset the number of enemies you kill, which is accomplished faster when your stats go up anyway. Replaying a stage while wearing an afro might constitute meaningful replay value for someone out there, but for me, I'll stick with action games that don't rely solely on unlockables to keep you coming back for more. Yet another game that Japan deemed unfit for North American shores. It's called Oz in Japan, but the story has nothing to do with the Wizard of Oz, despite characters being named Dorothy and Toto. This is a low-budget hack and slash that somehow runs at 30 frames per second despite looking like hell, and having short, flat levels sectioned off with tons of loading screens. And the 30 frames per second really hurts this game. Blood Will Tell also ran at 30 frames per second, but its combat is less hectic, so you could somewhat forgive it. Sword of Etheria is essentially a volleyball game crossed with a hack and slash. You juggle enemies by passing them between party members, and the longer you maintain that juggle combo, the more damage you deal and the more frequently you can cast special attacks that clear the screen. Most boss fights are also designed around this juggle mechanic. I haven't seen anything like this before. Your party members are surprisingly competent here, because they need to be for this system to work. They will call out the name of the character they will lob the enemy towards, and that's your cue to time your attack to hit the enemy before they touch the ground.
Almira! Got it, Leon! Almira!
But because the game runs at 30 frames per second, it feels just a bit too sluggish for this system to feel really responsive and satisfying. You drop your combos more often than you should, because you need to compensate for the input delay by timing your attacks a bit sooner than you'd like. this is another one attack button does everything game, but that one button is surprisingly flexible because you've got directional inputs. You can launch enemies, which is great for initiating juggle combos when your allies are near you, or you can swat them away if your allies are spaced out. Your dash can be turned into a pseudo stinger attack that can strike downed enemies. Plus, you can cancel certain animations like the launcher and the last hit of your basic combo. And the game has a measure in place to prevent you from abusing the juggle system. You can juggle dead enemies to build your meter, but if you deal enough damage to overkill them, they will disappear and your special attack gauge will start to rapidly decrease. So switching off from almost dead targets becomes the primary strategy. The fights can get chaotic at times, which is why you don't get a game over unless all 3 party members are dead at the same time. When your health bar is depleted, you go into this down state where you can mash X to revive yourself, and sometimes your allies will revive you. You can somewhat exploit the system by letting your allies soak in all the damage while you hang back and wait for them to revive, but that will impact your score. Scoring is interesting in this game because not only are you rewarded based on your performance, your ending changes depending on your overall stage rankings. Once you complete a stage, you can replay it and attempt to get a higher rank, but another incentive is you can change your playable character during a replay. They all control pretty much the same, just some minor changes, like the chick can jump higher and she's got better aerial moves, but you're still playing volleyball no matter who you choose. Beating the game unlocks more characters, some alternate outfits, and a higher difficulty mode, so it's got all the bells and whistles you'd expect from an action game from this era. But the highlight is definitely Michiru Yamane's soundtrack. You might recognize her work in the Castlevania series. She did the soundtrack for Symphony of the Night, and her music in Sword of Etheria is just as good. She's got a wonderful Baroque sound that's become her trademark, and the way she infuses that style into what are essentially metal tracks is nothing short of glorious. I actually found out about this game specifically because of Yamane. I consider her Castlevania work to be top shelf music, and when I found out she composed the soundtrack for an obscure action game, I knew I had to play it. And I'm glad I did. I saved the best for last. If you're gonna play any game on this list, give this one a try. This right here is the hidden gem. A unique mechanic that's incorporated well, a ton of content, and a decent difficulty curve. And believe it or not, it's even got an interesting story, even though most of it isn't voice. What really holds this game back and what ultimately makes it a mediocre game is the low budgetness of it. If this ran at 60 frames per second, it'd play so much smoother, but even at 30, you can get used to the performance and have a damn good time. There's a surprising amount of depth here between the branching structure inside some of the levels, dialogue options that affect the story, and item crafting which essentially lets you create builds for the characters. The combat doesn't come anywhere close to the greatness that is Devil May Cry, but it's not trying to be Devil May Cry. It's trying to be a volleyball action game set to vampire metal, and it succeeds. And that's ultimately what the point of this video was, to show you some action games that had interesting concepts, but were held back by some serious shortcomings. Even though I came across as extremely negative and maybe even dismissive for a lot of these games, I want to stress that none of them are bad, except maybe Demon Chaos, but for the rest, each one brings something worthwhile to the table. If they didn't, I wouldn't have talked about them at all. These mediocre action games were sadly overlooked in favor of the big players of this era. The PS2 had Devil May Cry 3, and Xbox had Ninja Gaiden Black. And to be fair, both of these games deserve every ounce of praise they've received and then some. They aren't some of the best action games of all time. They are the best, the pinnacle. When you try to hold something like poor Nanobreaker up to these standards, it doesn't stand a chance. If there's anything to take away from all of this, it's that a good idea alone cannot carry a game. You've probably met an idea guy in your life, or maybe you're the idea guy. You've got this great concept for a game that hasn't been done before, and you think everyone will love it. But a game needs to be more than just a cool mechanic, it needs to be a good game. When you try to structure your game around this concept, are these other elements working as support for this idea? Or do you expect that singular selling point to do all the heavy lifting? Seeing 60,000 enemies on screen at once is novel, sure, but what's the point if the action plays no different than any other game in the genre? And like I said at the beginning, this is just an appetizer for what the PS2 had to offer. There's an entire world of mediocre action games just waiting to be played. But don't let the internet trick you into believing they're worth $400.